Diocese, and she's now freelancing, I guess you could say. She's a writer, an educator, a facilitator, and she focuses very much on themes of spirituality and social transformation. And this afternoon, she's going to talk to us about sustainable communities, cultivating and nurturing habits to challenge power and to change the world. So Alison will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So do be ready with your questions. Alison, over to you.
Thank you. Am I in the right place, James? Oh, I can see my. Hello. Hi, everyone up north. And hi, everyone in the room. If I twiddle around a bit, that's okay. Still for both. Yeah. And I'll get my ginger juice ready. So it's great to be here in person. It feels like a long time since I've been in front of a live set of participants. I won't say audience, because that's not what you are. And yeah, looking at the theme of sustainable communities. And I want to start by getting your thoughts about, and well, your reactions to something. I'm going to read to you an observation by a pastoral theologian and psychotherapist, of whom more later. And I'd like you to listen to the quote, which I'll try and read quite slowly, and see if it resonates with your experience. So here's the quote. The average individual I encounter in the clinical situation today is not the same as the person who sat with me 30 years ago. Sometimes the changes are subtle. Often they are obvious, but they are pervasive and apparently widespread. There has been a marked increase in self-blame among those seeking my care, as well as an amorphous but potent dread that they are somehow teetering on the edge of the precipice. This is confounded by the appearance of a few individuals who seem far more self-assured and confident, even entitled or defiant, than I have previously witnessed. Somewhat mysteriously, these highly self-reliant souls seem more superficial and one-dimensional than their depressive or anxious cohorts. Meanwhile, addictive behaviours have become more prevalent and have quickly expanded into areas of life not usually associated with compulsivity. Relationships, even familial or romantic ones, seem to be becoming more ephemeral and contrived, almost businesslike. The people I now see tend to manifest a far more diffuse or fragmented sense of self, are frequently overwhelmed, experience powerful forms of anxiety and depression, too vague to be named, display less self-awareness, have often loosened or dropped affiliations with conventional human collectives, and are increasingly haunted by shame, rooted in a nebulous sense of personal failure. I find myself more disquieted and even confused than I used to be while sitting with people, even less myself. What has happened? Could you just put your hand up, including those on the screen, if anything of that rings true for you in any way? Okay. So in the room, that is, if not probably unanimous. And those on screen that I can see quite a lot of hands there too. Okay, so the quote comes from This brilliant book, which I shall hold up to, it's called Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age. And it's by Bruce Rogers Vaughan, who is both a practical and pastoral theologian and a psychotherapist. I've seen somebody do this, so I'm going to hold it up to. Does that come out right, or does it come out back to front? You can see how scientific I am. So the book explores the impact of global capitalism through the eyes of a practical and pastoral theologian and psychotherapist. And it tackles, and this is what I love about it, the whole spectrum from individual pain and suffering through to the biggest systematic material injustices that face us all today and their ideological roots. It is deeply sobering, complexly nuanced, but also curiously hopeful in that I think it gives us, and by us, I mean those of us who are part of Christian communities and congregations, urgent things to do. And by to do, I don't just mean activities, I mean thoughts and reflections and other forms of being. There's no way I could do justice to even a fraction of the things that Rogers Vaughan explains in a 30-minute slot. But my aim is to pick up some highlights of what he identifies as gone wrong, and this is very big picture stuff, and to explore briefly his analysis of what we need to build now. And with that in mind, I want to share with you something of one particular model of sustainable community building that I think can be important in this work of building back. And also explain why, for me, after more than 30 years in Christian social justice and community theology, I find that particular model so effective. And that model, so you know in advance, is community building. So firstly, identifying the problem, which of course is a whole network and set of issues. Rogers Vaughan explores in depth the growth of neoliberal global capitalism from the Reagan-Thatcher era to the present day, but also its historical roots before that, interestingly connecting right back to what Israel took us to this morning in terms of the early forms of capitalism, particularly slavery and the slave trade. Many of his observations will be familiar to us. Firstly, individuals have become commodities in a market of labour and consumption. We are reduced to human resources in an exchange market. That market is founded upon a free market ideology based on individual liberty and limited state government. Small government, the phrase, which isn't, is it? Human freedom becomes the freedom to consume as rational, self-interested actors in the competitive marketplace. Freedom, therefore, has been redefined on the market's terms, and society has been replaced by isolated and competitive individuals. Moreover, the actions of these individuals are based on self-interest rather than the common good. As global capitalism has taken hold, so there's been a rapid increase in economic inequality and class-based segregation, and a remarkable decline in the quality of social relations. Of course, this isn't just about economics, it has its effects in culture. If the organisation of human society is based on individualism and competition, this subtly and steadily influences our attitudes and feelings towards ourselves, including our understanding of the very meaning of the self, as well as our dispositions and feelings towards others. Combined with the erosion of belief in the common good, this leaves us with a society in which each person is increasingly encouraged to look out for their own interests and leave others to look after theirs. And whenever there's competition, there has to be winners and losers, right? Contemporary capitalism is a global system of expulsion. In the current global economy, millions of human beings are needed for neither production nor consumption. These unfortunate souls have become a permanent underclass. the existence of an ever-expanding population of migrants, refugees, prisoners, asylum seekers, the perpetually unemployed and other outcasts become what Zygmunt Bauman calls the waste products of globalization. Rogers Vaughan comments that prior to neoliberalism, domination was exercised by means of the disciplinary powers of institutions. Today, domination occurs through the suppression of these institutions. Corporations can't be doing with checks and balances. Prior to neoliberalism, domination required replacing a particular type of subject with a new form of subject. Today, it occurs through the fragmentation and dispersal of the subject altogether. And as the sense of ourselves as subjects is undermined, we begin to lose our voice. We struggle to make meaning from our experience. In this world of invisible power and untouchable actors, we suffer from a reduction of voice. And he points out that this is not universally applied because some lose their voice more than others, particularly those in extreme material inequality. The loss of voice will be unequally distributed, with those with fewer material resources more severely affected. And I think that happens globally between the voice of different nations, as Israel indicated about, for instance, vaccines and who got vaccines during the pandemic, and also within our own domestic context as well, as we see the impacts of inequality. So the inability to narrate one's life participates in the oppressions occurring at the intersections between class, race, sexuality, and other forms of social injustice. So everything is mixed up together in terms of inequality. Stated theologically, he says, these conditions are weakening the human soul. And it's interesting that we have this book, Soil and Soul, at the beginning, introducing the word soul into our proceedings. For him, soul means a connective tissue linking us together as a human community, as well as to creation and the eternal and the transcendent. And within theological education, you will know that many scholars have begun to argue that advanced capitalism now poses the most significant threat to the human spirit, to civilization, and to the health of the planet. Again, we've already heard that from Israel this morning. He cites Rosemary Radford Reed and Susan Brooks Thistlethwaite, but you will add many more to that list. And just one last, what I think is a particularly poignant and urgent passage from him. Quote, "It is no coincidence that crises such as climate change and the rapid depletion of natural resources are occurring in combination with other symptoms of social breakdown. Rising mental disorders, mindless consumerism, materialistic conformism, status competition, civic disengagement, startling economic inequalities, global financial instability, and widespread political inertia. While these crises are usually studied in isolation, they are all interconnected." And there are some other really brilliant thinkers at the moment that are looking at those interconnections, and I would recommend Bruce Alexander's work on the globalization of addiction, Gabor Mate in Canada on trauma and addiction, and again, connection with what Israel was saying about trauma for communities, e.g. Black communities across the world, and what that means in terms of the communal effect of those traumas on groups of people with individual bodies, but also bodies of people. and Wilkinson and Pickett, whose work you may well know on inequality, particularly their book called The Inner Level, which very much talks about the impact of inequality on the inner person, people that we are. And just as an aside, before I go on to the optimistic bit, because you're probably feeling a bit, I think it's worth asking ourselves from the perspective of Christian communities, the question that Rogers Vaughan asks of the psychotherapeutic community. How have we colluded with normative neoliberal systems? In what ways have we, and I'm quoting him now, instilled adaptation to society rather than resistance? In what ways have we functioned in accordance with the values of production and consumption rather than the values of communion and wholeness in relation to others and the earth? In what ways have we focused on symptom relief rather than justice making? And in what ways have we accepted personal responsibility rather than interdependent reliance within a web of human relationships? That's where the self-blame comes in the opening quote. So moving on then to building sustainable community. So as I said, you'll see why it's sobering reading, but how is this work and how are we to respond? And Bruce Rogers Vaughan offers 3 things, which again have echoes of what we've heard already. Firstly, we need to strengthen human collectives. Secondly, we need to nurture and increase soul. And thirdly, we need to amplify hope. So collectives, soul, and hope. Now, I just want to talk a bit about the model of community organising and the ways in which I believe that particular model can speak into those 3 things. And I'm talking about community organising as exemplified in the UK by Citizens UK. There's also government strands of community organising, but I'm talking about the specific Citizens UK model of community organising. And those who are unfamiliar with it, you might want to check out the website of Citizens UK, which is incredibly comprehensive. And I want to cite the work of Angus Ritchie, who's a theologian at the Centre for Theology and Community in East London. And also Selina Stone, who is a theologian, political theologian on St. Mellitus course, who's also very interested in community organising. Angus's introductory pamphlet on the CTC website is entitled People of Power, How Community Organising Recalls the Church to the Vision of the Gospels. In his words, community organising is a structured process which brings together grassroots institutions like churches, mosques, and schools in a particular town or city to work, to act, in common concern. It originated in the USA in the 1930s and has been growing in the UK since the 1990s. And some of you may know that the most well-known advocate of community organising in the US is, in fact, Barack Obama, who came into politics through community organising. In short, community organising starts from an awareness that whilst the market and the state are organised in their own self-interest, the so-called third sector is not. So, as explained, collectives of all kinds have waned in importance under neoliberalism, and this has weakened participatory democracy and undermined any ways of building people power. Community organising aims to address issues of social injustice through a distinct methodology and discipline. It begins with listening to people, their passions and their concerns. In shorthand, what makes people tick? In organising terms, what are people's self-interest? Systematic listening campaigns built on one-to-one conversations. The one-to-one is a basic building block of organising. It's an intentional conversation where the agenda is the other person. Having done that and heard people's experiences The idea is when you find a common self-interest that needs a change, you work towards that change. And the interesting thing I find from a Christian perspective is the importance in that of the power analysis. 30 years of Christian social justice have taught me that the church is very bad at engaging with issues of power. Power analysis is conducted in order to take effective action on particular injustices. There is a constant focus on developing leaders who can testify to their experience and give voice to it. And in community organising terms, leaders are defined as those closest to the injustice, who are often those otherwise marginalised and oppressed by systems of power. Change is won in a way that empowers leaders to build agency. Winnable campaigns that build incrementally people's self-confidence. All meetings and actions are evaluated by a method akin to the pastoral cycle, and broad-based alliances of diverse institutions are evolved that are constantly listening to those in communities through one-to-ones, such that their institutions are strengthened, and also they become part of a long-term collective of collectives across difference. The power comes through the number and diversity of people that an alliance represents. This broad-based alliance ultimately works through an annual cycle of action for change, calling power holders to account, but can also, interestingly, respond quickly to crises and challenges. So when the pandemic kicked in, Citizens UK, which embraces the different broad-based alliances on the ground, began to just hold weekly Zoom meetings where rapid listening exercises were happening in communities, and that experience was brought into a national forum, and from that quickly began to build a picture of who was losing out in terms of the pandemic, what were the likely inequalities that were going to arise, and how could that be responded to. Equally, with the Ukrainian refugee situation, we are here in Oxford Diocese, as Oxford Diocese is part of, has a strategic partnership with the UK. It was immediately able to respond to the Ukrainian refugee crisis and set up an intermediary way in which individuals could offer their support and be supported in that. That's very much an emerging situation. So, just going back to the human collectives, soul and hope. I don't have time to do all this. So Angus Ritchie explaining why community organising focuses on institutions. Institutions attract a lot of suspicion, some of it justified, but an institution is just a set of structured relationships which emerge when human beings agree to be faithful to one another across time. That's what a scout group, a trade union, a marriage, and a mosque have in common. It is one of the characteristic myths of our culture that such commitments restrict our freedom. In fact, our institutions are vital to our freedom. They enable us to build relationships of solidarity and trust across boundaries of race, age, and religion. Without them, we are isolated individuals, and our lives and communities are dominated even more by the power of the market and the state. Now, this has all sorts of outworkings. I work a day a week as a missionary theologian in residence for Citizens UK, and we're building a community of practice for those involved in churches and community organising. And it's interesting how the focus is both on how the institutions, i.e. the churches involved in broad-based alliances, are themselves strengthened, and how the alliance works together for particular aspects of change. And when you start to do one-to-ones internally within a congregation, as well as externally, as I'm sure you can imagine, and as I'm sure you do this in other ways, it has quite a transforming effect on how those congregations work, because people are intentionally engaging around issues that are maybe not often talked about, with fellow members of the congregation. And when you do a power analysis internally within a congregation, and Angus Ritchie has done this in the churches that he's worked with in East London, if you want new people to join a congregation, but you leave the congealed power structures in place, what happens? People come in and then leave again. So there's no space. There's no way of changing the way things are done. So if you do a power analysis about who has the power and influence in this church and how do we all keep that moving, listen to people who are new coming in, listen to people who've maybe been here for ages but haven't had a voice in one-to-one with a person. It will change. The congregations will change, as well as them changing because they're engaging with a whole range of other institutions from the community. And that, to me, is about solidarity and deep solidarity, that engagement with difference. I'm going to skip the next bit, but apart from to say that, to me, one of the selling points, sorry, that's a very unfortunate term, it just shows how infiltrated we are with the terminology of the market. Just take that as a learning experience. One of the positive things about community organising to me is that it's not a Christian organisation. And when I put to the Bishop's Council of the Diocese the idea that we should become a strategic partner with Sisters UK as a diocese, but it's not a Christian organisation. That's why it's so effective to be part of it. And it's effective because you don't have to leave your beliefs at the door as you do in some other contexts, or abandon the distinctiveness of your conviction. Action is taken only on issues that everyone can agree on. That's based on listening and what are the issues of the people in the community. And what's surprising, as Angus Ritchie says, is just how much diverse groups can agree on. For example, the seriousness with which Muslims take Quranic teachings on usury has inspired Christians to engage at greater depth with biblical teachings on these issues. And so churches and mosques have been at the heart of a successful community organising campaign for the legal cap on the interest rates of payday loans. So that's collectives. Soul. Interesting to hear what you all think the word soul means, but for Rogers Vaughan, it is not another word for the individual spirit as conceived by capitalist-inspired individualistic spiritualities. The soul that Rogers Vaughan suggests we need to increase, in his words, inhabits a collective home. Indeed, he argues that individuality, because it is dependent on the soul, arises only in a communal context. You cannot be an individual without first being part of a community. Soul, he says, is the quite substantial fabric that weaves us all together and with all that is. We are all entangled. Soul inhabits a collective body, a body that exhales hope. Which brings us to hope. Hope. How is hope amplified by this re-emphasis on collectives and the embracing of soul as the fabric that weaves us together in those collectives? And I think, and I'll just say this briefly, there are two ways. Firstly, and paradoxically, I think the articulation of pain and suffering. And secondly, the discovery that change is possible and we are not powerless. Like physical pain, psychological, relational, and spiritual suffering has a function. It calls us to take action to address a threat or a problem. Sufferings insist on finding a voice. Rogers Vaughan says, I and we have learned that when unheeded, pain produces the structures of alienation, injustice, ignorance, division, and isolation into our individual and collective lives. I and we have also learned that when articulated and heard, pain may yield and structure connection, continuity, integrity, justice, and direction into our individual and collective lives. The articulation of pain through one-to-one listening and through small group conversations and through leaders who would remember those closest to any issue, whether that's not getting the real living wage or having to use a food bank or being the subject of gender-based or sexuality-based violence or racist violence or Islamophobia, bearing witness, sometimes in small groups, but sometimes to audiences of hundreds or thousands, is not simply therapeutic, it is also political. It is in itself resistance. And finally, hope comes through winning, but winning that is not, it's kind of the byproduct of the real point, which is people before program. But winning, whether it's a group that get together because they need a zebra crossing outside a school, or whether it's people getting together, as have happened, because a listening campaign with young people discovered that they had nowhere, Muslim and non-Muslim, to meet together to hang out and have a meal. So they have a campaign to get Nando's to serve halal chicken. Who would have thought that that's a major issue for young people of Cardiff? But it was. Or a campaign when a Methodist, a food bank based in a Methodist church did a listening campaign and found that everyone using it, most people using it were in work, but were still needing the food bank. And they found that most of them were employed by the local airport that was not paying the real living wage. So there was a long campaign to win the real living wage, which, let's not forget, is, as opposed to the minimum wage, it's probably £2 more-ish an hour. So, in conclusion, I hope that this exploration of soul and the need to revivify our collectives, which I think churches are so well placed. We're already doing it, and let's make the most of that, and let's do it in new ways, which I know all of you here have an interest in. And I just want to stop with a short bit of a poem, because I suddenly remembered this morning I was going to use this, and when Johnny talked about poetry, I thought, I'd forgotten, I will use it. It's a short bit from Adrienne Rich, who's a Jewish lesbian poet from the US, and she has a long poem called Dream of a Common Language. Somebody's nodding. My heart is moved by all that I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, through no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. Thank you. Sorry, that was longer than I said, Catherine.
Thank you, Alison. Gosh, I studied Adrienne Rich at Auckland Uni.
Did you?
Good to hear you mentioned. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. And good to end on the positive note, the idea of strengthening the collective, amplifying the soul, hope, change is possible. I loved your phrase about congealed power structures. That was a very evocative metaphor. And thank you for introducing us to Bruce Rogers Vaughan. Sounds like a fascinating book. So thanks so much, Alison. And don't worry if you missed some of that, because we hope to publish an edition of Anvil out of this conversation today. So we're hoping that Israel's and Alison's and Janet Williams' papers, presentations will be in it, as well as some of the workshops. So you will be able to read it at your leisure. And of course, it's been recorded. So we do have a few minutes for questions. So James will monitor the chat and we can take questions from in the room. So anyone got any questions for Alison?
Yes.
Is it Valerie on mute? Valerie's lips are moving, but she's on mute. I don't know whether it's Valerie that's speaking. Valerie, is it you? If so, you're on mute.
Unmute. Now you can hear me? Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay,
yes.
I just wanted to go back to the first, to Israel's talk, when he was talking about the global South's unfair receipt of the pollution arising from the north, from Europe. Okay, I just wanted to remind people that Latin America is also the global south. It's yes, it's Africa and Southeast Asia, but we in Latin America have the same problem. That's all I wanted to say. We're south too.
Yep.
Thank you, Valerie. A good reminder. Any questions for Alison?
It doesn't have to be a question. You might just want to offer a thought or a reflection.
Thank you.
How far do you see things like the emphasis on mindfulness and well-being, which I think in some ways are good things, but on the face of it, seems like as a response to neoliberalization, need to adapt constantly to the market,
Yeah.
So you're stressed because society's out of kilter, but you need to adapt.
That's a really good question, and it's something that Rogers Vaughan talks about quite a lot, in the sense of, since we are as individuals now responsible for everything as individuals, we are also responsible for our own well-being. And I suppose it's akin to what Andrew Solomon talks about when he writes about mental health, and he says we're basically in a structure that's creating mental ill health.
Yeah.
And the things that we can do to mitigate that are kind of a bit like wearing sunscreen in global warming. It is purely a mitigation to stop you getting skin cancer. All sorts of mitigations you can make to individually feel a bit better. But actually what we're talking about is our contextual conditions, which will not be addressed. And we all individually respond differently to those contextual conditions. Some people, as he says, manage to be Teflon and defiant and just get through, although one wonders how permanent that can ever be. And others of us demonstrate vulnerability and mental ill health, and we have anxiety and we have depression, and anything we can do to mitigate those things and feel better, well, not quite anything, but anything that's productive and creative and positive, then yes. But I think it's interesting how, I go to yoga classes, I love doing it, and I see that as part of a spiritual integration of the spirit and the body. Not everybody necessarily treats yoga like that. Same with mindfulness. So there are things we can incorporate, I think, into things that we, as spiritual, religious, Christian people, are doing to make the world a better place. But for me, I always think it's got to be always in the context of the political structures and what are the bigger changes that we're trying to make, and how does our experience of those things help inform that, and what can we learn? So if suddenly, as is happening, people are having mental health crises, and there's a massive increase in adolescent mental health issues, we can't just say, oh, well, it just must be that lots of young people can't cope anymore, they don't have the strength and resilience. Actually, something structural is going on, something systemic is happening, and we need to know what that thing is. So that's, it's a kind of both and, I think. But definitely a lot of the ways in which those things are marketed to us are precisely that. They're marketed to us, as is religion a lot of the time. And that's the thing about collusion.
But, sorry, I'm looking at the clock. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry, Israel. But because people are online, we've got to try and keep to time because we're in different venues, and we're going to be coming back.
Could we hear 2 comments? Sorry, are you going to take? Sorry.
I need to get us into the next Zoom meeting.
No, it's James that's pulling around.
Oh, I see.
So should we show our appreciation, Jonathan?